The marble floor gleams like a mirror under the mansion's crystal chandeliers, and Aria Harper stumbles through it, leaving a trail of crimson that catches the light. 9:47 in the evening. October dry, the kind of night where the air tastes like dust and copper. She is 28 years old but looking closer to 45, her face hollowed by years of working double shifts, her brown hair matted dark with sweat and something worse. The black and white maid's uniform that she irons every Sunday hangs loose on her frame, and now it is soaked dark red across her chest and stomach. 2 gunshot wounds. 1 in her left shoulder. 1 in her abdomen. She can taste blood in her mouth. She can taste it like coins on her tongue. Behind her, gunfire still cracks from the study. Another shot. Then another. Then silence that is somehow louder than the violence. Her shoes slip on the polished floor. The sound echoes through the corridor like a bell tolling. She collapses against a marble column, leaving a handprint the color of rust as she slides down the cool stone. Her breathing comes in ragged, wheezing gasps. Each one feels like it might be the last. Footsteps pound toward her. Running. Fast. Heavy. Marco and Pietro round the corner at a dead run, their black suits identical, their weapons drawn, and they freeze absolutely still when they see her crumpled on the floor. Not a word. Just the sound of their breathing and the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the distance. Their hands hover over their weapons. They do not lower them. They do not move. They simply stand there staring at the small, broken woman bleeding onto the floor of the man they have served for 15 years. Then Luca Bianchi emerges from the study. He is 6 feet 2 inches tall and broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who fills a room the way a storm fills the sky. His white dress shirt is splattered with blood that is not his own, the cuffs rolled back to his elbows. A fresh cut runs along his jaw from his ear to his chin. His scarred hands, the hands that have held a gun since he was 16 years old, are trembling in a way that makes Marco and Pietro exchange a look of pure terror. Because in 15 years of working for Luca Bianchi, they have never seen his hands shake. They have seen him stand in front of federal prosecutors without flinching. They have seen him order men into darkness from which they never returned. But they have never seen him afraid. He sees Aria on the floor and drops to his knees like someone has cut his legs from under him. His voice cracks when he says her name. Aria. He kneels beside her and pulls her against his chest, his scarred hands cradling her like she is made of glass, like she might shatter if he holds too tight. Her head falls back. Her eyes flutter. Her lips move. The words come out barely a whisper, trembling like a candle in the wind. I couldn't let them, she breathes. You have a daughter. Emma needs you. And then her head falls to the side and her eyes close. But what she did not know in that moment, as she lay bleeding on the marble floor with the most powerful crime boss in Las Vegas cradling her body, was that this single act of courage would unravel secrets that had been buried for 8 years. This moment would set fire to the carefully constructed lives of people who believed themselves untouchable. This moment would destroy empires and build something stronger from the ashes. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you deep in your chest. Share it with someone you love. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Because what happened next will shock you. Now let us go back to the beginning, to 8 years earlier, when Aria Harper first arrived in Las Vegas carrying everything she owned in a single duffel bag and a pair of child shoes wrapped in tissue paper. 8 years earlier. The Greyhound station in Las Vegas smelled like diesel fuel and broken dreams. The air was so hot it pressed against your skin like a living thing. Aria stepped off the bus at 5 in the morning, and the desert sun was already climbing the sky, turning everything golden and pitiless. She was 20 years old then, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her look older. Her brown hair hung in a braid down her back, the kind of braid you do when you are trying to be invisible. Her clothes were the cheapest department store could sell. Her shoes had a hole in the sole that she had covered with duct tape 3 months ago. In her right pocket, $78 in cash. 3 $20 bills and 18 ones, counted and recounted so many times her fingers knew the exact texture of each bill. In her left hand, a duffel bag containing 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, 1 dress she had worn to her mother's funeral, underwear, and a bra with a strap held together with a safety pin. Wrapped in tissue paper and tucked against her ribs like a secret, a pair of child's first shoes, so small they fit in the palm of her hand. Red velvet with a silver buckle. They had belonged to Emma, and Emma had been gone for 3 years. She did not cry about Emma anymore. Her tears had dried up somewhere on a Greyhound bus driving through Arizona, and they had not come back. Aria walked out of the station into the desert heat and made herself a promise. She would work hard. She would save money. She would build a life where nobody could hurt her. Nobody would take anything else from her. Nobody would break anything else that she loved. The Venetian Hotel and Casino rose up from the desert like a palace, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers and the kind of beauty that only money could buy. Aria had walked past it 3 times before she gathered the courage to walk inside. The lobby was the size of a cathedral. The floors were polished marble, the kind that reflected the light from the chandeliers so perfectly that the whole place looked like the inside of a dream. Tourists walked across that marble in designer shoes they would wear maybe 3 times in their lives. Aria in her duct-tape shoes stood at the edge of the lobby and felt the size of an ant. The restaurant manager's name was Douglas Hale. He was 53 years old and had the kind of face that looked like it had been angry for so long the anger had calcified into something permanent. He sat behind a desk in a small office and did not look up when Aria entered. Experience. His voice sounded like rust. I can learn, she said. I am very fast. I am very careful. He looked up then. His eyes moved across her face and her body the way a predator's eyes move across prey. You speak English good. Better. I speak English better. Smart mouth, he said. We don't hire smart mouths. He turned back to his paperwork. Next. But Aria had $78 and she had to eat. She had to rent a room. She had to survive. So she stepped forward and said, I will work for less. Whatever you normally pay, I will take less. Douglas Hale's mouth curved into something that was not a smile. It was the expression of a man who had found something he could bend. 40% less than minimum wage. You work the night shift. Breakfast service, lunch service, dinner service, late night bar. That is $75 a day if you last that long. Most girls don't. Something about the hours. Something about the customers. He leaned back in his chair. You look like you might be desperate enough to last. Yes, Aria said. I am desperate enough. The night shift started at 4 in the afternoon and ended at 2 in the morning, or whenever the last customer left, which was usually 3. The restaurant was called Venetian Dreams, and the irony was that it served no dreams at all. It served pasta drowning in oil, chicken that had been cooked in batches and kept warm under heat lamps until it tasted like rubber, wine that cost more than she made in a month. On her first night, Aria spilled red wine across a man's white shirt. She was carrying 4 plates and a water pitcher and a bus tub, and her hands were shaking because she had not slept in 36 hours, and the plates tilted just slightly and the wine came up over the edge of the glass like a wave and soaked the man's chest. He stood up and grabbed her wrist. His fingers dug into the soft skin below her palm. You stupid little nothing, he said. Do you have any idea what this shirt costs? She did not answer. She did not pull her wrist away. She simply stood there and let him hurt her because she needed this job and he was a customer and the customer was always right. Douglas Hale appeared from behind the bar. He watched. He did not help her. He watched with an expression that looked almost like pleasure. After that, the man's hand on her wrist became the norm. The customers who groped her as she set down their plates. The tips that were stolen by Douglas before they were handed to the staff. The 18-hour shifts that became normal. The bruises on her shoulders that she hid beneath long sleeves even in the sweltering heat. Aria worked and saved. $75 a day, minus $60 for a room in a boarding house, minus $20 for food, left her with $1.90 to save. On a good day, when she could eat the leftover pasta from the trash, she saved $5. 365 days a year multiplied by $5 equals $1,825 a year. At that rate, it would take her 50 years to save $90,000. She did the math in her head every night as she walked home at 3 in the morning. 50 years. She would be 70. Emma would be 53. Emma, who was only 5 years old now, who lived with a family Aria would never see again, who might never know that her mother had tried. One night in her tiny room under the fluorescent light that never truly went dark, Aria took the red velvet shoes out of their tissue paper and held them in both hands. They were so light they seemed like they might float away. She thought about Emma learning to walk in these shoes, how Emma's feet must have looked so small in them, how Emma must have needed someone to hold her hand while she learned to balance. Aria had not held Emma's hand. Aria had been 17 years old and sick and terrified and homeless, and the state had taken Emma away because Aria could not provide. The shoes were all she had managed to keep. She wrapped them in the tissue paper and tucked them back against her ribs. The next morning, Margaret Harrington walked into Venetian Dreams for breakfast. She was 32 years old and her father owned the hotel. She had blonde hair that had been highlighted by someone who cost more than Aria made in a month, and she had the kind of face that comes from never having been told no. She sat at a table by the window, and when Aria brought her orange juice and coffee, Margaret looked at her the way someone looks at a stain on the floor. "This is not fresh squeezed," Margaret said, though Aria had poured it from the fresh squeezed juice dispenser visible behind the bar. "Yes, it is," Aria said quietly. "It came from the machine marked fresh squeezed." Margaret's eyes went cold. She set the glass down and said, "You see that tag on your uniform? It says you are an employee of my father's hotel. That means you work for me too. And I do not accept that tone. I do not accept that attitude. If you speak to me like that again, I will have you deported. I checked your papers when I came in. Seems like they might have some irregularities. Seems like immigration might be very interested." Aria's throat closed. Her papers were fine. She had checked them 100 times. But she said nothing. She simply took the orange juice back to the kitchen and squeezed a fresh orange by hand and brought it out, and Margaret drank it while staring at her phone, not looking at Aria's face. That became the pattern. Margaret coming in, finding something wrong, threatening deportation. Aria standing silent. Aria invisible. Aria disappearing a little bit more each time. And the red shoes wrapped in tissue paper, pressed against her ribs, growing heavier with each passing day even though they never gained an ounce of weight. Aria Harper counted the bills 3 times because numbers were the only truth she could trust anymore. $78. That was everything. The bathroom tiles at the Greyhound station were sticky beneath her bare feet. She had taken her shoes off to count better, sitting on the toilet lid with Emma asleep against her shoulder, the 5-year-olds breathing shallow and trusting in a way that made Aria's chest tight. $78 had to stretch across 1 week. Maybe 2 if she rationed the powdered milk and bought the generic bread that sat in bins near the expiration date at Save-A-Lot. A knock came at the door. "Lady, you can't be in here." Aria stuffed the bills into her pocket, pulled Emma closer, and stepped back out into the fluorescent glare of the Greyhound station, where the smell of diesel fuel mixed with stale coffee and someone else's hopelessness. The Venetian Hotel rose up from the Las Vegas Strip like a cathedral built for people who were not her. She had been in the city for 3 hours. She had showered in the YMCA for $5, borrowed a safety pin to fix the hem of her interview dress, and written down the address 3 times on her hand because she could not afford to get lost. Emma held her hand now, her small fingers wrapped so tight around Aria's thumb that circulation stopped below the knuckle. The girl had not spoken since Phoenix. The social workers said this was normal. Trauma silence. Aria preferred to call it survival. The less Emma said, the less likely anyone would send her away to live with strangers. Douglas Hale's office smelled like expensive cologne covering something rotten underneath. He sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from the same marble that lined the hotel floors, and he did not stand when Aria entered. She noticed this. She noticed that he looked at Emma the way a butcher looks at meat, assessing weight, quality, potential profit. His suit was navy blue, expensive, tailored. His hair was slicked back with something shiny. When he smiled, his teeth were too white and too many. "You have hospitality experience." His voice was not kind. It was the voice of a man who had never been refused. "I worked at a diner in Phoenix for 2 years, Aria said. This was true. It was also true that the owner had never paid her in cash, that her paycheck bounced twice, that she had eaten what the customers left on their plates because she was not allowed to buy employee meals. References. "My former employer passed away," she said. Another truth. Another lie by omission. The owner had died of a heart attack, and his widow had sold the diner to pay creditors, and Aria had gotten $30 severance and a kick out the door. Douglas leaned back in his chair. "You'll start tonight. Uniform is black and white. Tips go in the communal jar. I distribute them fairly among all staff. You'll work doubles on weekends. No benefits until after 90 days. Your daughter," he glanced at Emma, who was staring at the corner of his desk, "will stay at the hotel daycare during your shifts. That's deducted from your paycheck." Aria did the math in her head. $40 a week for daycare. 12-hour shifts at minimum wage, which was $5.25 an hour in 1996. She would make roughly $300 a week before deductions. Enough for a room in the cheapest motel in North Las Vegas. Barely enough for Emma's food. The asthma medication had not started yet. Emma's cough was just a cough then, something a 6-year-old could live with. "Okay," Aria said. "One more thing." Douglas leaned forward. His eyes were the color of old pennies, and they held no warmth. "The girls who work here are assets. You represent the Venetian. If I hear that you are bringing any kind of negative attention, police, social services, any kind of trouble, you will be terminated immediately. No notice. No final paycheck. You understand me?" She understood. She understood that he could see her for what she was, a woman with nothing to lose except the small child holding her hand. A woman vulnerable enough to break. A woman alone. "I understand," she said. That night, she worked from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning. Her feet swelled in shoes that were not quite the right size. She carried trays heavier than her own weight. She smiled at men who looked at her like she was part of the furniture. She cleared plates where people had left exactly $0 tips, and she watched Douglas Hale stand in the corner, watching the servers, his expression calculating and cold. A woman named Charlene, who had been at the Venetian for 5 years, showed her how to fold napkins into swans. "Don't expect the money they promise," Charlene whispered. "He takes a cut. Says it's administrative fees. It's not." By the time Aria clocked out at 2 in the morning, every muscle in her body was screaming. Emma was asleep in the daycare room, curled up on a mat with 6 other children, and Aria carried her to the motel room they would rent for $39 a night. She laid Emma on the bed, covered her with the thin comforter, and sat on the floor with her back against the wall, counting the tips in her pocket. $14. For 8 hours of work. She put $13 aside for Emma's food and kept $1 in her pocket, feeling the weight of it like it was gold. She did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to Emma breathe, and she made herself a promise: her daughter would not spend her childhood like this. Not if Aria could help it. Not if she had to work until her hands fell off. 6 months passed like water through a sieve. The asthma diagnosis came. The medication was $85 a month, which meant Aria picked up more shifts, which meant Emma spent more time in the daycare, which meant Aria's debt grew anyway because the rent at the motel went up to $42 a night and Emma needed new shoes and the winter came early that year. She was now working 60-hour weeks, sometimes more. She was 21 years old and she looked 35. Then a recruiter came into the Venetian. A woman with expensive sunglasses and a tablet. She was hiring for housekeeping at private residences, she said, and the money was better. Much better. $40 an hour instead of $5.25. Aria's hand shook when she filled out the application in the break room. She did not believe it was real until she got the call that she had been hired to work at the residence of Luca Bianchi, a businessman whose household required 12 staff members. She quit the Venetian the same day. But the bills did not stop. Emma's asthma got worse, not better. The medication needed to be refilled constantly. There were doctor visits that cost money that Aria did not have. So 6 months after starting at the mansion, she went back to the Venetian on weekends, begging Douglas for her old job back. He said yes, of course. Because he knew she would say yes. Because she had no choice. Because she had a child to feed. Now she was working 2 jobs. 7 days a week. From 7 in the morning until 7 in the evening at the mansion, then from 6 at night until midnight at the Venetian on Saturdays and Sundays. The mansion work was silent work. Invisible work. She cleaned the marble hallways, dusted the leather furniture, organized closets that were larger than her childhood bedroom. The other staff members barely acknowledged her. She was young, she was foreign, her accent was still slight but noticeable, and she was the lowest paid. So they looked through her, not at her. The money was better, though. Not good money. Better money. Enough that Emma could stay in the mansion daycare instead of the Venetian daycare. Enough that Aria could afford the asthma medication without skipping meals herself. Enough that she could save, slowly, painfully, $1 at a time. She kept Emma's first shoes in her purse. They were so small they fit in the palm of her hand. She had gotten them from the shelter where she had delivered the baby alone, the shelter where they had taught her how to change a diaper and warned her that the world would not be kind to young mothers. The shoes were wrapped in tissue paper, and she carried them everywhere because they were proof that Emma had existed before the poverty. That there had been a moment, however brief, of joy. On a Tuesday evening in October, the mansion was quiet. Too quiet. The household manager had given everyone the evening off except for Aria, who was finishing the study. She was dusting the leather-bound books on the shelves when she heard voices in the hallway. Men's voices. Tense. She should leave. She knew she should leave. But the door to the study was heavy and it creaked when you opened it, and if they heard the creak, they might wonder who was in there. So she stepped behind the velvet curtain instead, her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. The door opened. 2 men she had never seen entered, their footsteps sharp against the marble. Then Luca Bianchi came in behind them, and even though she could not see him, she could hear the shift in the air. The way the men's voices changed. The way the room bent around him like he was the sun and they were planets in orbit. "You are holding product that belongs to my family," Luca said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath, and it came from somewhere in his chest that had no softness. "I want it back by tomorrow night, or people are going to start dying. Starting with your sister's family." The silence that followed was the silence before thunder. Aria pressed herself against the wall behind the curtain, barely breathing. She could feel sweat gathering at the base of her spine. Then gunfire. 3 shots, sharp and terrifying, nothing like the gunfire from movies. The sound shattered the silence like a mirror breaking, and Aria's mouth opened in a scream that had no sound. One of the visitors had pulled a weapon. There was shouting. More shots. Then running. The sound of glass breaking, and the men were gone. Aria stood behind the curtain, trembling, her ears ringing. She could hear footsteps coming down the hallway. Multiple people. Running. The door to the study burst open and 2 men in suits appeared, their weapons drawn. They scanned the room, and then their eyes landed on the curtain. Aria's hand was visible. Her name tag was visible. Everything was visible. The footsteps stopped. One of the men raised his gun toward the curtain, but then a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Lower your weapons." Luca Bianchi stood in the doorway, and even though she could not see him through the heavy fabric, Aria knew it was him by the absolute certainty in that voice. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Aria stepped out from behind the curtain. Her legs were shaking so badly she was not sure they would hold her. There was a man standing in front of her with his gun still half raised, staring at her like she had just appeared from the air itself. Behind him was another man, taller, with a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone. Both of them looked at the small woman in the black and white maid's uniform, covered in dust, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her brown eyes enormous with fear. Luca Bianchi lowered his gun. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone. There was blood on his white shirt. There was a graze across his forearm, bleeding steadily, dripping onto the expensive hardwood floor. He stared at her for a long moment. The other men exchanged a glance. Neither of them moved. "How long have you been there?" His voice was quiet now, which somehow made it more dangerous. "I didn't hear anything important," Aria said, and she was amazed that her voice came out at all. "But you're bleeding." Without thinking about it, without calculating the risk, she reached up and began to untie the strip of fabric that held her apron closed. Luca's hand moved toward his gun, a reflex, but he stopped himself. He watched as she tore the fabric into a long strip and approached him. The two lieutenants stiffened. Marco and Pietro. She would learn their names later. Right now, they were watching this impossible thing, a maid approaching their boss with no weapon, no threat, nothing but steady hands and the absolute certainty of someone who had seen blood before. She wrapped his arm carefully, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. She had dressed Emma's scraped knees. She had wrapped her own wrists when the swelling got bad from carrying hotel trays. Her hands knew how to do this even though her mind was screaming to run. "This needs stitches," she said quietly. "The graze is not too deep, but it will get infected if you do not clean it properly." Luca Bianchi looked down at his arm, where this small, invisible maid had wrapped him with such certainty. He looked at her face. Her features were fine and dark, her skin olive-toned. She was perhaps 26 years old. She was terrified, but her hands were not shaking. "What's your name?" he asked. "Aria Harper, sir." He said her name once, slowly, as if tasting it. Behind her, Marco and Pietro watched their boss look at this maid the way they had never seen him look at anyone. Like she was not invisible. Like she mattered. "Go home, Aria Harper," he said. "Forget what you heard tonight." "I will," she said, and she meant it. But forgetting something is not the same as leaving it behind. And some encounters change the shape of everything that comes after, even when you do not realize it in the moment. Aria walked out of that study and into the October night, her heart still hammering, her mind still ringing with gunfire, and she did not know that Luca Bianchi was watching her leave. She did not know that Marco was speaking in low tones to his boss, saying things like impossible and dangerous and this is not wise. She did not know that everything she had carefully built, her invisibility, her safety, her separation from the world of men like him, was about to shatter like that mirror of silence, like glass breaking in the dark. 2 weeks after that night in the study, Luca Bianchi stood alone in his office and watched the security feed from the east corridor. Aria Harper moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She dusted the mahogany table. She straightened the oil paintings. She flinched when Pietro dropped a file on the marble floor 3 rooms away. Even through the grainy camera, even through the black and white static of surveillance footage, he could see the way her shoulders tensed at sudden sounds, the careful placement of each foot, the economy of gesture that spoke of a woman used to being invisible. Used to being hurt. Something in that careful movement reminded him of his own childhood, of learning to move quietly so the fists would not find you, of becoming small enough to disappear. He should not care about a maid. Luca Bianchi had built an empire on ruthlessness. He had ordered men killed for far less than disrespect. He did not have time for invisible women who cleaned his floors. And yet, he picked up his phone. "Marco. My office. Now." Marco arrived within minutes, solid and loyal in his tailored suit, a man who had served Luca for 15 years without question. "Boss?" Marco's eyes were careful. He had learned long ago not to ask questions. Run a background check on Aria Harper. Everything. Employment history, family status, criminal record, finances, medical records if you can get them. I want to know who she is. Marco's eyebrow rose slightly, but he nodded. It will take 3 days. I have time. The background check arrived on the 4th morning. Marco placed the folder on Luca's desk with the kind of delicacy usually reserved for explosives. Luca opened it alone. Single mother. Daughter Emma, age 13, with chronic asthma so severe that emergency room visits averaged 3 times per year. Works 2 jobs, the mansion at 40 hours weekly and the Venetian hotel at approximately 30 hours, though the math did not add up. Income, $2,400 monthly from Luca's household, approximately $1,800 from the Venetian, but hotel records showed she should be making significantly more. Someone was skimming. Stolen tips, approximately $6,000 over 8 years. No criminal record. No family listed. No emergency contacts except Emma's school. Medical debt, $23,000. Monthly medication for Emma, $850. Hospitalization debt from 2 years prior, $15,000. Current savings, indeterminate, but her checking account showed deposits averaging $78 remaining before the next paycheck. Luca read the last line twice. $78. That was everything she had. The entire buffer between her daughter and catastrophe. He had spent more than that on espresso this week. He had tipped servers more. Aria Harper was drowning and she cleaned his floors like nothing was wrong, like her daughter's lungs were not slowly failing, like she had not been robbed blind by people who wore better suits than she did. The pattern was familiar. He had grown up inside this pattern. Violent men who took what they wanted from people who had nothing to defend themselves with. His father had been such a man, a carpenter with brutal hands who drank away the rent money and blamed his 7-year-old son for the family's poverty. Luca remembered the apartment in South Vegas. The roaches that moved like a separate species. The sound of his father's belt being unfastened. The cold mathematics of survival: do not cry, do not speak, do not breathe too loud, because any sound might provoke the fists. He had clawed his way out of that apartment at age 16 and built everything with his own hands and blood and will. He had sworn that no child under his roof would suffer like that. No child. No one. But Aria Harper's daughter was suffering. And Aria was letting her. 3 days later, Luca created a situation. He cut his left hand deliberately while reviewing documents, not deep, but enough to bleed crimson across white paper. He called for Aria. When she arrived, he was wrapping it incompetently, like a man who had never tended his own wounds. "Help me with this," he ordered. She approached carefully, the way someone approaches a large animal that might turn dangerous. She unwrapped his poor bandaging, examined the cut with steady hands. Her fingers were calloused, her nails cut short, her touch efficient and practiced. She cleaned it with antiseptic that smelled sharp and chemical. "This was not an accident," she said quietly. "Not a question. An observation." "No," he admitted. "You wanted to test something." "Maybe I just wanted to see if you would run." She finished wrapping his hand with precise movements, tied it off. "I do not run, Mr. Bianchi. I cannot afford to." The honesty was like a knife. "Why not?" "Because I have a daughter who needs me. And running does not pay for medication." She stepped back, lowering her eyes. "Is there anything else?" "Yes. Come to my office tonight. After your shift." She arrived at 8:15, still in her maid's uniform, smelling faintly of lavender soap and fear. Marco and Pietro stood by the door, their presence a statement. This meeting was important. Luca had never had a private conversation with a member of the household staff. His lieutenants exchanged glances of profound confusion. "Sit," Luca ordered. Aria sat, spine rigid despite the exhaustion bruising the skin beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled in her lap. I know about the Venetian. About Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington. The words dropped like stones into still water. Aria's face drained of color. I know he steals your tips. I know he forces 18-hour shifts. I know Margaret Harrington threatens you with deportation even though you are a citizen. Sir, I... Explain what? That they are bleeding you dry and you have done nothing because you are afraid. His voice was not cruel, which was somehow worse. Why have you not fought back? Aria's hands clenched. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Because I have $78 to my name and a daughter who needs $85,000 in 3 days for surgery. I cannot afford to fight. I cannot afford to lose either job. I cannot afford anything except survival. The number hung between them like a held breath. 85,000. 3 days. What is the surgery for? Luca asked. Her lungs. The asthma has caused scarring inside her airways. Without intervention, she has maybe 2 years. Aria's voice cracked, but she did not cry. The hospital sent a final notice yesterday. 3 days or they escalate to collections. They might involve child services for medical neglect. Behind her, Marco and Pietro watched their boss lean forward, watched his expression shift into something they had never seen directed at anyone. Gentleness. Intention. The kind of focus that usually preceded someone's destruction, except this time it was aimed at protection. I will pay for it, Luca said. All of it. $85,000. Today. Surgery tomorrow. Aria stood so abruptly her chair scraped against the marble floor, a sound like a scream. No. Absolutely not. Sit down. I will not. I know what you are, Mr. Bianchi. I know what you do. I will not be in debt to you. I will not owe a man like you. Her voice was shaking but firm. A maid, refusing a Mafia boss. Marco's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket before he caught himself. Luca stood, walked around the desk until he was close enough to see the exhaustion bruising her eyes, the faint marks on her shoulder where a collar had been pulled too tight. You would not owe me anything. Consider it a bonus for 8 months of excellent work. I dust shelves. I clean bathrooms. That is not worth $85,000. You are a woman who saw me bleeding and helped instead of running. You have not reported the abuse you suffer to anyone, which means you have not been thinking of yourself. You think of your daughter before you think of yourself every single moment of every single day. That is worth far more than $85,000. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Why would you help me? I am nobody, Aria said finally. You are not nobody to your daughter. And you are not nobody to me. That night, Aria lay in her small apartment in the Henderson district, listening to Emma's breathing in the next room. The apartment was old, the walls thin, the heating unit grinding in the darkness. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the impossible offer. One phone call could change everything. One conversation could mean Emma lived past 30. One yes could mean she was no longer alone in this. In the morning, she returned to the mansion and found Luca in the study with his coffee, reading something on his phone. When he saw her, he set it down without hesitation. I will accept, she said without preamble, on one condition. You tell me why. The real reason. Not kindness. Not charity. The real reason. He studied her for a long moment, and she saw something pass across his face, a shadow of old pain. I had a father who used his fists more than his words. I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment in South Vegas with roaches and mold and not enough food. I was beaten for breathing too loud. I clawed my way out and swore that no child would suffer because of an adult's cruelty if I had the power to stop it. He paused. The rain outside began to fall, tapping against the windows like fingertips. Your daughter is suffering because Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington are stealing from you. I have the power to stop it. So I will. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. $85,000 transferred within the hour. Aria watched the confirmation email arrive on her phone and felt something in her chest break open, not from pain, but from relief so profound it was almost unbearable. But what she did not know was that Douglas Hale had noticed her absence. 2 days later, Douglas cornered her in the Venetian parking lot at midnight, the October wind carrying the smell of diesel fuel and rain. He had been drinking. His shirt was untucked, his breathing heavy. "You think you can just take days off? You think you are special?" He grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, shoved her against her car. The metal was cold even through her thin jacket. "You owe me for every dollar I have given you. You have stolen from me for 8 years," she said, and somehow found courage she did not know lived inside her. He slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the parking garage. Stars bloomed in her vision. "You will work tomorrow. 18 hours. No pay. Or I will make sure you never work in this city again." The next morning, Aria called Luca from the hospital waiting room while Emma recovered from surgery. Her voice was steady. "I need to tell you something about Douglas Hale." She described 8 years of theft and abuse, the stolen tips tallying approximately $6,000, the forced overtime shifts, the threats, the bruises he had left on her shoulders hidden beneath long sleeves, the scar tissue on her back from when he had shoved her into a storage rack. She listed it all like a ledger of survival. 8 years, she said quietly. "I never told anyone because I was afraid." "You are not afraid anymore," Luca observed. His voice was different now. Quieter. Sharper. Like a blade wrapped in certainty. "No. Because my daughter is safe. And I am done being invisible." That evening, Margaret Harrington found Aria in the Venetian lobby during shift change. Margaret was 34, draped in labels that cost more than Aria's monthly rent, Gucci, Prada, diamonds that caught the lobby lights. Her father owned the hotel. Her cruelty was protected by infrastructure and legacy. A crowd of evening guests moved around them like water around stone. "I heard your little brat had surgery," Margaret said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "How did you afford that on a maid's salary? Steal it?" She smiled, and her smile was the smile of someone who had never been told no. "If you ever try to report Douglas or me, I will have you deported. I do not care that you are a citizen. I will fabricate documents. I have the money and lawyers to destroy you." The guests watched. Aria felt the old fear rising like floodwater. But then she remembered something Luca had said. "You are not nobody to me." "Do your worst," Aria said clearly. Her voice did not shake. Margaret's smile faltered. For the first time, the mouse had roared. What Margaret did not know was that federal investigators were already moving, their phones ringing in offices 300 miles away, their cases building in the darkness. Douglas Hale's office smelled like leather and expensive cologne, the kind that tried to cover something rotten underneath. Aria stood in the doorway at 2:56 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, her hands trembling in her pockets. The office was all mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the strip, everything designed to make a person feel small. Douglas sat behind his desk. 56 years old, grey at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. Margaret Harrington lounged in the leather chair across from him, perfectly composed, one leg crossed over the other, diamonds catching the sunlight like tiny accusations. They had planned this moment. Aria could see it in the way they sat, the way their eyes met briefly before focusing on her. "Close the door," Douglas said. Aria closed it. The sound of the lock clicking felt like a coffin lid sealing. "We have a situation," Margaret began, her voice smooth as poisoned honey. "A staffing issue. A theft, actually." Douglas leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. $12,000 in hotel property has gone missing over the past 6 weeks. Expensive linens. Minibar inventory. Guest toiletries. We have witnesses prepared to testify that they saw you taking items from the supply closet. "That's a lie," Aria said quietly. Provable lie or not, the charges will stick, Margaret said. She smiled, and her smile was a blade. We have 5 employees who will swear they saw you. Douglas has already drafted the police report. You'll be arrested within the hour of us filing it. You'll spend the weekend in custody before arraignment. Your daughter will be placed in foster care Monday morning. The room tilted. Aria gripped the edge of the chair to steady herself. Douglas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below like a general surveying conquered territory. Unless you make this easier on everyone. You resign today. You leave Las Vegas by midnight. We withdraw the charges, and your record stays clean. You walk away, and Emma stays with you. And if I don't? Aria's voice came out as barely a whisper. Then, Margaret said, leaning forward, we destroy you. We have the lawyers to bury you in legal fees you can't afford. We have the connections to ensure every hotel in this city knows you're a thief. And when you're in federal prison for 5 to 7 years, Emma becomes a ward of the state. Do you understand what that means? She'll be in the system. Group homes. Foster care. Moved every 18 months. Trauma on top of trauma. Aria understood. She understood with perfect, crystalline clarity. You have until midnight, Douglas said without turning from the window. Pack a bag and go. That's your only choice. Aria walked out of that office without speaking another word. She walked past the housekeeping station where she had worked for 8 years. She walked past the lobby where 200 guests moved through their comfortable lives. She walked out into the October afternoon where the temperature was dropping and the sky was turning grey at the edges. By 2:24 a.m. that same night, Aria Harper stood on a pedestrian bridge over the I-15 freeway, watching cars blur past below like blood cells moving through veins. The desert cold had teeth. It cut through her jacket and bit at her skin. Her breath came out in visible clouds that disappeared into darkness. She was 31 years old and she had $78 in her wallet. $78. That was her entire existence reduced to a number small enough to fit on a receipt. 8 years of Douglas's hands on her shoulders, leaving bruises shaped like ownership. 8 years of Margaret's voice dripping contempt in front of guests, calling her the help as though that was her name. 8 years of double shifts, of eating leftover scraps from the kitchen, of counting every penny twice because there were never enough of them to count even once. And for what? The railing was cold under her palms. So cold it burned. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, a rhythm like a countdown timer. Emma was asleep in their apartment 3 miles from here. Emma, who had just had surgery 2 weeks ago. Emma, who needed stability more than anything in the world. Emma, who had asked her this morning, will you always come home? Yes, baby. Always. But how could she come home if she had nowhere to go? Dead leaves scraped across the concrete bridge like fingernails on a coffin. The wind came in gusts that pushed her hair across her face. She was invisible. She had always been invisible. Nobody saw her except when they needed something. Nobody would notice if she just stepped back from this railing and let herself drift down into the endless stream of taillights below. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital, surgery recovery progressing beautifully. Emma asking for mommy. 3 words below that, sent at 2:52 a.m., when you coming home? Aria's hands tightened on the railing until her knuckles went white. Then her entire body collapsed. She slid down against the cold metal until she was sitting on the concrete, her legs folded beneath her, and she wept in a way she had never allowed herself to weep before. The tears came from 8 years of swallowing her own voice. The tears came from every time she had smiled while being degraded. The tears came from the knowledge that she was about to lose the only person in the world who mattered. But she didn't let go of the railing. She texted back with shaking hands, soon, baby. Mama's coming home soon. Then she called Luca Bianchi. He answered on the second ring, as though he had been waiting for this call. Tell me, he said. I need help, Aria said. Her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I'm ready to fight back. Tell me everything, Luca said. Every detail. Every bruise. Every stolen dollar. Every threat. All of it. So she did. For the first time in 8 years, Aria Harper spoke every truth she had swallowed. She listed the $6,000 in stolen wages. She described the bruises Douglas had left on her shoulders. She told him about Margaret's threats in the lobby, delivered in front of witnesses, captured on the hotel's security cameras. She told him about the false charges being filed at midnight. She told him about Emma being taken away on Monday morning. When she finished, there was silence on the line. Not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of someone calculating. Stay on the bridge for 30 more minutes, Luca said. Do not move. Do not call anyone else. Marco is 7 minutes away. When he arrives, you will get in the car, and you will come to my penthouse. Bring only what fits in a bag. Emma's medical records. Your identification. The things that matter. They are filing charges at. They will not file anything, Luca said. His voice was quiet, which made it more terrifying. I am ending this tonight. The line went dead. Aria sat on that cold concrete bridge for 32 minutes. A black SUV with darkened windows pulled up to the curb at 3:24 a.m. Marco emerged, 6'2", 300 pounds of muscle wrapped in a tailored black suit. He was one of Luca's oldest lieutenants, the kind of man who had seen things that most people would never see and never speak about. He looked down at Aria sitting on the concrete, tears frozen on her cheeks, and his expression didn't change. But something in his eyes softened. Get up, he said. Not unkind. Just factual. Aria got up. Her legs had forgotten how to move. Marco steadied her with a hand on her elbow, and they walked to the SUV. She climbed into the back seat, and Marco drove through the empty streets of Las Vegas toward the city center. At 5:15 a.m. on October 23rd, while Aria was still in the penthouse with Luca reviewing everything that had happened, federal agents were moving into position. Marco had coordinated with the FBI hours earlier, once Luca had made a single phone call to a contact he had cultivated for situations exactly like this. At 6:13 a.m., 12 FBI agents in tactical gear arrived at Douglas Hale's home in Henderson. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch in a development that had seen better days. Douglas answered the door in a terracloth bathrobe, coffee in one hand, the morning paper in the other. His face went the color of old bone. Douglas Michael Hale, the lead agent said. She was a woman in her mid-40s, Hispanic, with the kind of eyes that had seen men like Douglas before and would see him again after he was gone. What is this? I have rights. I have lawyers. You're under arrest for wage theft, assault, extortion, and labor trafficking. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say. Douglas's hand started shaking. The coffee cup fell and shattered on the tile floor. He sank to his knees without being told. The agents cuffed him while he begged, his voice cracking like wet plaster. Please, I can fix this, I can pay back the money, please. By 7:15 a.m., he was in a police vehicle, face obscured by his own trembling hands, being broadcast live on every news channel in Nevada. At the exact same moment, Margaret Harrington was in the Venetian lobby, dressed in a tailored suit that cost $4,000 and a smile that had just murdered someone's hope. She was in the middle of a breakfast meeting with a potential business partner, mimosa in hand, when 8 federal agents surrounded her table. The lobby fell silent. 200 guests and staff turned to watch. Margaret and Harrington, the agent asked. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my father is? Margaret's voice rose to a shriek. This is a mistake. I will destroy your careers. You're under arrest for embezzlement, extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and falsification of documents. Stand up slowly. Margaret tried to run. She made it 3 steps before agents caught her. Her phone fell to the ground and skittered across the marble. Her perfectly styled hair came undone as they cuffed her. She screamed the entire way out, her mask cracking into pieces as guests filmed every second on their phones. Her mugshot, mascara running, face contorted with rage, went viral within 90 minutes. Douglas Hale's trial lasted 8 days. The evidence was airtight. Security footage from the Venetian showed him pocketing cash from tip jars night after night for 4 years. Bank records documented $47,000 in stolen wages across 12 employees. Medical records from 3 of his victims showed injuries consistent with his assault. Expert testimony about the psychological impact of his extortion left several jurors crying. The sentence came down on a Friday morning, 40 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility for 25 years. The judge's voice was quiet as she delivered it. You preyed on the vulnerable for years because you believed you would never face consequences. This court disagrees. Margaret Harrington's trial revealed that she had embezzled $1.2 million from her father's hotel chain over a 7-year period. She had used falsified documents and threats of deportation to silence employees who discovered her theft. The evidence showed that she had personally approved 3 instances of Douglas's wage theft in exchange for a cut of the stolen money. 40 years. No parole eligibility for 25. Her own father released a statement through his lawyers. Margaret Harrington is no longer a member of my family. I am cooperating fully with federal investigators. On the day of sentencing, both Douglas and Margaret were led out of the federal courthouse in shackles, their mugshots broadcast on every screen in Nevada. The story dominated news cycles for an entire week. The mouse who had roared had brought 2 predators to their knees. But what Aria did not know was that this was only the beginning of what Luca Bianchi had put into motion. 3 months after Douglas Hale and Margaret Harrington disappeared into federal prison, Aria Harper stood in the marble hallway outside Luca Bianchi's study, her housekeeping uniform pressed and clean, her hand steady as she arranged fresh flowers in a crystal vase. The other staff members no longer looked through her as if she were invisible. They nodded. They asked her opinion. They used her name. Something had shifted in the mansion's atmosphere the night the bullets came, the night 2 assassins learned that this quiet woman in a black uniform had more courage than anyone they would ever meet. Luca's voice came through the study door, deep and solid like an oath. Aria. Come in. She set down the vase. The flowers, white orchids, trembled slightly as she released them. The clock in the hallway read for 48 in the afternoon, and the October light fell through the windows in long, slanting gold. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. Luca sat behind his desk, but he was not doing paperwork. He was simply sitting, watching the door as if he had been waiting. He was a tall man, 6'2", with a kind of muscular frame that came from violence and legacy both. His Italian suit, charcoal, tailored, worth more than her annual salary in her old life, hung perfectly on his shoulders. A thin scar ran from his left eye to his cheekbone, a permanent reminder of a lesson he had learned long ago about mercy being a luxury powerful men could not afford. But his eyes were different in this moment. Softer. Less like a man who commanded empires and more like a man who had seen something break open inside himself and could not quite stitch it back together. Sit, he said. She Saturday. The leather chair felt expensive under her thighs, the kind of expensive that whispered about money she had never touched, never imagined touching. Emma is in school, he asked. Yes. Her surgery follow-up appointment is next week. The doctors say her lungs are clear now. Completely clear. Aria's voice was still quietly trembling in the way it had trembled that night on the study floor, but less now. Healing was a slow thing. She's asking about joining volleyball. Then she will join volleyball. Luca leaned back in his chair. Aria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Not what you think I want to hear. Not what you think is safe to say. The truth. She waited. You cannot work as a maid forever, he continued. I see you in the hallways at dawn, moving like a ghost, cleaning spaces that don't need to be cleaned because you cannot sit still when there is work to be done. You're intelligent. You're capable of far more than dusting shelves and arranging flowers. So I'm asking, what do you actually want to do? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody had ever asked her this. Not her mother, who had spent her life running from men and backward into poverty. Not Douglas Hale, who saw her only as a source of stolen tips and free labor. Not Margaret Harrington, who saw her only as something beneath the soles of her shoes. She was 28 years old, and in all those years, nobody had ever asked her what she wanted. The silence stretched between them like a blade. Before Emma, Aria said quietly, before the Venetian, before I understood what survival meant, I used to cook. Her eyes were somewhere else now, somewhere in the past where she had been younger and less broken. Nothing fancy. Just simple food made well. A neighbor taught me. She had a kitchen in a small apartment, and I would stand there watching her transform cheap ingredients into something beautiful. I wanted to open a restaurant someday. Nothing big. Just a small place where people could come and feel less alone while they ate. Luca was still. The afternoon light caught the gold watch on his wrist, the one that had cost more than her shelter and medical care combined. Then that's what you will do, he said. Over the next 3 months, Luca Bianchi became her silent architect. He connected her with a commercial real estate agent who owed him favors. He navigated the labyrinth of business licenses and permits, making phone calls, pulling strings that stretched across City Hall like invisible rope. He introduced her to suppliers, men and women who had worked with him for years, who now treated Aria with respect that had nothing to do with her position and everything to do with whose investment she carried. He never asked for equity. He never asked for control. He never asked for gratitude, though she offered it repeatedly. This is too much, she had said one evening in his office. I can't accept this. It's too much. Luca had looked at her with those soft, scarred eyes. You took 2 bullets for me. This is nothing. She didn't understand it then. The shooting hadn't happened yet. This was a man investing in her future before she saved his life, because he had seen something in her that was worth saving. And that was a different kind of power than the power that lived in guns and empires. But what neither of them knew was that rival families had begun to notice Luca's unusual attention to his maid. The Calabrese family, led by a man named Vincent who had been hungry for Luca's territory for years, saw an opportunity. They saw something Luca was protecting, and they understood the oldest rule of warfare: strike at what your enemy loves, and your enemy will bleed. 9 months after Douglas Hale's arrest, on an October evening when the desert wind came through the city like a whisper of death, everything converged. Aria was cleaning the hallway outside Luca's study when she heard the gunshot, not from outside, not from an intruder, but from inside the study where Luca was supposed to be alone. Her hands went still. The cloth she held for dusting fell to the floor. The second gunshot echoed down the marble hallway like a blade through silence. She ran. She threw open the study door and found 2 men in dark suits standing with weapons drawn, demanding territory and respect and the kind of payment that came in blood. Luca was on his knees, bleeding from a shoulder wound, his expression the kind of controlled fury that meant he was calculating how to kill both of them before they killed him. But he would die. The math was simple. 2 armed men, 2 guns, seconds to spare. Without thinking, without hesitation, without letting reason have a single moment to whisper that she was nobody and should act like it, Aria threw herself between them. The first bullet hit her left shoulder, tearing through muscle and bone with the burning pain of touching fire. The second hit her abdomen, and her leg simply stopped working. She fell. The sound of her body hitting the marble echoed longer than the gunshots had. Luca's scream of her name was the last thing she heard before the world went soft and dark and very, very quiet. 3 days later, Aria woke in a private hospital room with sunshine falling across white sheets. The best doctors in Las Vegas had spent 8 hours and 45 minutes stitching her back together. Her left shoulder would carry scar tissue and pain for the rest of her life. Her abdomen was wrapped in bandages that would need changing every 4 hours. But her heart was still beating. Emma was safe. The Calabrese hit had failed. Luca sat in a chair beside her bed, unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed, still wearing the blood-stained shirt from that evening. Her blood. His blood. The blood of two men who would spend the rest of their lives in federal custody, unable to walk, unable to move without pain. You should have run, Luca said, his voice rough like gravel. You should have let me handle it. Her voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. You would have died. I've survived worse. So have I, Aria said. That's why I couldn't watch someone else die when I had the power to stop it. He recognized his own words, the words he had spoken 3 months earlier on the mansion stairs, spoken back to him like a prayer he hadn't known how to pray. Recovery took 6 weeks. Luca visited every day. He brought Emma to see her. He sat in the plastic chair while Aria's daughter read to her from a book about a girl who learned to fly. He made sure she had everything she needed, the best pain management, the best physical therapy, the kind of care that only unlimited money and unlimited devotion could provide. But he kept his distance emotionally. She noticed. After everything that had passed between them, he seemed to have drawn a line and resolved not to cross it. 1 year passed. In that year, Aria's restaurant, called Emma's Table, became a quiet success in a small neighborhood on the east side of Las Vegas. She served simple, perfect food. She employed 3 people and paid them well, with health insurance and paid time off and the kind of dignity that comes from being seen as human. She had moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment where Emma had a room of her own and Aria had a kitchen with good light. Emma, now 14, was thriving. Her lungs were healthy. She had friends. She was learning to fly. Aria stood on her apartment balcony one evening at sunset, watching the Vegas lights begin to glow in the distance. The October wind was dry and cold but no longer cutting. The restaurant had opened 6 months ago, and she had not seen Luca Bianchi since the day they closed on the building. She told herself this was good. He had given her the tools to build a life. Now she was building it alone, as she had learned to do. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. Luca stood in her doorway, and for a moment neither of them breathed. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I always know where you are," he said. He joined her at the railing. They stood in silence as the city lights flickered on, one by one, 1,000 tiny fires blooming in the darkness. The wind moved through their hair, and neither of them moved away from it. "I need to tell you something," Luca began, his voice rougher than usual. "When you stepped in front of those bullets, you saved my life. But you saved more than that. You saved my soul. I was becoming my father, cold, cruel, indifferent to everything except power. And then you stepped forward. You took fire meant for me. And I realized I didn't want to be that man anymore." Aria's breath caught. "I spent a year trying to convince myself it was gratitude," he continued. "Trying to keep distance because you deserve better than what I am. But I can't stay away anymore. I just need you to know, you are far stronger than you think. And you changed my life." Aria reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined like 2 pieces of a puzzle finally finding their shape. "I used to think strength meant surviving alone," she said quietly. "But you taught me that sometimes strength means accepting help. Means letting someone see you broken and still choosing to love you. And you taught me that the strongest thing a person can do is step forward when everyone else runs away." They stood together on the balcony as the October night settled around them, and the storm that had raged so long inside both of them finally passed. Aria Harper started with $78 in a pocket and a child's first pair of shoes wrapped in tissue paper. She endured 8 years of abuse and invisibility. She faced 2 bullets and hit rock bottom on a bridge at 2 in the morning, convinced she had nothing and was nothing. But she didn't let go. She fought back. She built a new life with her own hands. And she learned that strength isn't about never falling, it's about standing back up and asking for help when you need it. If this story moved your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of courage and redemption. Drop a comment. Have you ever stood up for someone when you were afraid? I read every single one of them. New story drops tomorrow. Until then, remember this, the storm will pass, and you are far stronger than you think. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you again in the next video.